You will receive the signal from the transverse, which is a complex system in a different phase than the signal I want to place. Do you remember the details of this process? Yes, we are. Indeed, in Tunisia, a beautiful country with rich history. Bye-bye, Mich. Okay, let me repeat it again. May peace be upon him, and all of it is a bit confusing, but hopefully by God's will, you will understand it. Again, this is a mistake. I want to clarify the first phase. All right, they are training on the limbic channel, and they are applying it to the transverse. Is this clear, or is there a problem? Stay with me, just in case we need to clarify things together. All right, is the gradient time short or long? Short, that's the problem. There is a part that remains in the transverse that I have. This part gives me a signal with a frequency and a phase, meaning it comes to me at a certain time or at a certain angle, which they call the phase angle, meaning in a specific order starting from zero. So everything starts from zero in a certain way, with a certain shape. When you apply the second RF pulse, you still have some transverse left because the time is short. The time you apply the second RF pulse is short. So when you detect the signal from the second RF pulse, the transverse gives you a signal and the lumbotron gives you a signal. So you want to completely eliminate that transverse and make your image dependent only on T1. So we understood the problem. Where is the issue? The problem is clear now. What can you do to eliminate the transverse? You said we tried the previous two methods, but they weren't very effective. This method is effective. You said we will give the RF pulse in the second cycle, different from the first one. Both have the same frequency, but each has a different phase. This means that the transverse signals coming from the first RF pulse, if they produce a signal while you are recording, in the second signal in the array will come to you in a different phase. So what can I do at that time? You can eliminate their signal from the image. You can remove their signal from the image that comes in a different phase. In this case, you will only take the signal that comes from the T1 weighted image or what is present when you acquire it. This is what I am doing. This is what I am doing. The first RF pulse signal at this position is referred to as 3 o'clock, for example, and the position of the second RF pulse is at 6 o'clock, for instance. Look at the shape of the receiving signal. It's as if you are receiving a signal from the first RF pulse. Is there any residual, or is the magnetization from the first one affecting you? You don't want that to impact you, so what do? When you pick up the second pulse, you will detect it, but with a different phase than the transverse one that was coming from the residual. This way, it won't affect you. Do you understand? Is that clear? Well, we do this in signal processing, of course. What you are doing is not like this approach or method. No matter what you do, the effect of what you are doing, Dr. Rahani, will not be significant in any significant manner, especially since you are working on your image. For you, the helical is for you, in any significant manner. May I ask about the application? I want to tell you that it provides you with an image that is almost a more precise image than a T1 weighted image. This image is because I made it myself. It was made by myself using a sequence. In summary, this image is better for you than the regular T1 weighted image, as even in spin echo, it provides more information, more resolution, or a better signal to noise ratio. For example, this is after contrast enhancement, such as after the injection of a contrast agent resulting in this image. The T1 weighted image is when you inject gadolinium, injecting contrast, injecting a dye that is referred to as spoiled gradient or incoherent gradient. The goal here is that you are focusing on transverse. The main aim is that you are focusing on transverse. Right, doctors? Exist? These two pieces are also really great. I mean, I want to leave them from tomorrow, but let's just give a small piece. Well, you know, we were indeed talking about, we were definitely talking about, if the doctors remember, as you may recall, we were talking about the topic of you giving. It relied on time of flight, where we said that you provide the saturation pulse we were talking about, and you perform saturation of the magnetization while the subject is stationary. Then, after that, the blood flow starts to move and enters this area, and you begin to receive the pride signal that was present, resulting in higher longitudinal magnetization than the steady state of the existing magnetization. Now the question is, why is this topic indeed a somewhat sticky? Is the blood flow correct? For example, if we are talking about an area like cerebral angiography, if we are discussing something where the blood flow is slow, for instance, your technique relies on the blood flow moving quickly, right? Or am I wrong? If this movement is slow, that could affect you, meaning you won't find the process running smoothly. There must be another technique, especially since you might need to work on something else. The light from the aorta, that's why even in cerebral angiography, there are things with contrast enhanced, and there is something called phase contrast. What is the topic of phase contrast? Phase contrast means that you do something based on the movement of blood flow. In this context, what does this mean? Essentially, it refers to the technique where the movement of blood flow is analyzed to provide more detailed imaging. To elaborate, this method allows for a clearer understanding of how blood circulates, which is crucial in medical imaging. He told you that you are, as we see here, you are here, and this is moving, and this is also here. The idea is what you are doing. For example, you will apply it, and after you do it, it will work in this way. This is what we do in gradient. Echo, sequences. For me, you prefer to track your signal in the case of stationary, or in the case of motion, where the protons are not moving. Since they are not moving, they remain in the same place in the gradient, so they are fixed. There is no movement, so they all execute together, and all of them will execute together. Consequently, all the protons will generate their signal, and you will find that there is no problem at all. But flowing is a substance that moves. As it moves, it interacts with the magnetic field differently within each voxel. This causes variations, meaning not all protons will behave the same way, leading to this effect. We need to start looking at creating something called a specific shape for certain magnitudes, and a specific structure that depends on the phase shift occurring in the protons present in the blood. This way, when you apply this shape, if you accept this gradient, which is referred to as flow compensation gradient, it will ensure that all the protons present are in phase. The protons present all exhibit a phase shift. This technique relies on the velocity of the protons present in the regions. What this means is that if you take a specific image, or if you manage to detect the phase shift occurring in protons, you perform something called velocity encoding gradient. What is this flow? It refers to the speed of protons. Essentially, you have a gradient that has a certain magnitude of change per centimeter. This magnitude of change occurs as protons move from one location to another, starting to cover a certain distance, for example, from this point to that point. So, it starts with the fact that it has an effect due to a certain force from the gradient, which gives it a specific phase as it moves to the second point, resulting in a different phase. This distance can be calculated mathematically to determine the velocity of the protons. This movement from here to there indicates its speed. How does this benefit you? It helps you because at that moment you are dealing with a location that is, for example, previous, meaning that the flowing part moves and is replaced by another, and so on. Your flow remains constant as you work on your flow. Thus, as a result of the phase shift that occurred, you can expect to apply a certain gradient that compensates for the shift that happened in that phase with the velocity of the protons during the gradient. This is what I call the phase contrast image, or MRI angiography, which relies on phase contrast. This is what happens in cardiac design, as it relies on physical design. With the movement of the heart, or with cardiac movement, there is a change in the movement of the voxel. If you take flow in it, or take a specific design, movement occurs. Therefore, there is a need for high detectability regarding the plot flow that occurs. A phase shift will occur at the level of the existing voxels, or intervoxel, or intravoxel, and intervoxel between each voxel and the next, and even at the level of the existing voxel. Thus, flow compensation is applied to achieve very accurate detection of velocity. From there, a gradient is created. This gradient performs flow compensation. It ensures that your protons are affected while this is happening. What does fluidity encoding do? This is how the image seems to appear to you. This image is your case, and you always find it doing this at first, in the beginning. And then he starts to feel. The individual who holds the position of responsibility is accountable for the way your image is presented and appears in this particular manner and format. This includes ensuring that all aspects of the image are displayed correctly and meet the required standards and expectations set forth by the organization or project guidelines. They call it Intrafocal phase and interfocal phase mean what? Intrafocal means at the level of a single voxel, and interfocal means between one voxel and another. It starts to identify the phase shift that occurs and begins to determine the VNCD. And based on that, it starts to give you what it begins to return and keep, and starts to extract from it what is finalized, and gives you this as a technique among the techniques. All right, doctors. Okay, but why doesn't it also focus on the background? Because it takes an image. It takes something from moving structures. That's a point. And there are some techniques that use taking an image before applying this and perform subtraction. That's a point. And there are some techniques that use taking an image before this applying and perform subtraction. Subtraction is performed for distortion, because if you take the image without adding this gradient, you will have the high signal related to the distortion. Therefore, you can perform subtraction of the existing image. The story relies on phase contrast, which is considered highly sensitive to the time of flight. The story is based on the phase contrast, which is a fascinating concept that delves into the intricate details of how different facial features interact with each other. It considers how the flow moves from one area to another, creating a dynamic and ever-changing landscape. When you work with blood flow, it moves from the neck to the cerebral area, a journey that is both complex and vital for the functioning of the human body. Is the speed of blood flow from the neck to the cerebral area similar to the speed of blood flow in the aorta or in the femoral artery or in the geographical region? This question opens up a myriad of possibilities for exploration and understanding. I believe the topic is different, offering a unique perspective on the interconnectedness of various systems within the body. This is what made the time of light may not be, 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 may not be. The remaining part was that Dr. Islami, you mentioned that you talked to me about sending me information on the perfusion IMSs and the thank you notes. We will finish this after the exam.
It's not difficult here because the only thing for the open ones is the spoiled, but the rest is easy. So we have the magnetic resonance spectroscopy and perfusion. And what else? I feel like, let me just see the...
Okay, Dr. Hani, what were you asking about? I'll take advantage of this quarter hour or half hour for that. And the board, doctor, is fine. The board is easy. The board is easy, God willing. It's based on deoxyhemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin, which means it's simple. It relies on the paramagnetic properties. So it's easy, God willing, no problem. But Dr. Hani was asking about some questions. We might just need to review them together. I mean in the VFL.
I told you that I wasn't in the lecture, and I mentioned that there are things like the K-space filling and the application or the phase encoding with high radiant, right? Right? At the same time, when we give a spin echo, we will create the 4 lines on top of each other, and we will place the slice selection here, and then the phase, and then the frequency.
Pray, 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 pray for the king, Dr. Hani. I have the MRI image consisting of some nice voxels or pixels. The idea is that I want each of these squares to give me information. As a receiver, I want to differentiate between what is present in this row if I connect my data in this way. All of these will receive the same signal and return the same signal. Why? They will return the same signal. Okay? In this case, I can't make any distinction. So what do I want to do? I will create a gradient that changes the movement of the protons present in all the voxels. Okay? What will I benefit from this change? I will benefit from it because when I receive the signal that I sent, it will come to me differently. It will either come in a different frequency or in a different phase. How does this work? You see, we are doing what with the 90-degree pulse? When I give a 90-degree pulse, I have several slices to take. The first thing I want to do is differentiate this slice from the other slices. If I want to image the brain, if I give the entire brain a series of pulses, if the brain is excited, excitation and relaxation will occur. If the brain is excited, excitation and relaxation will occur. If the brain is excited, excitation and relaxation will occur. If the brain is excited, excitation and relaxation will occur. If the brain is excited, excitation and relaxation will occur. If the brain is excited, excitation and relaxation will occur. If the brain is excited, excitation and relaxation will occur. If the brain is excited, how can I make one rotate at a different speed than 2, which is different from 3? So when I give the 90-degree pulse, I give it at a frequency corresponding to what I want to work on. This is the slice selection gradient. All right, I will take slice 1, and I will find that it consists of columns and rows. The gradient will be applied in the y-axis for the proton, and the gradient will be applied in the x-axis. It is referred to in the y-axis as encoding gradient. They will work with specific degrees. What are these degrees? They will work with angles at certain stepping angles. For example, sometimes at 0, sometimes at 100, and sometimes at other values. Each time they will angle the gradient, and each time it's as if they are capturing a signal from a specific line from a single row of your image. Okay? So you have worked on the y-axis, distinguishing between here and here and here and here and here. Then, when you come to record your signal, you need to apply frequency encoding gradient to differentiate between the voxel on the x-axis. The idea is that now you have the gradient on the y-axis is not only applied to this column, it encompasses all slices from left to right or from right to left, which is the frequency encoding gradient. This gradient includes all your slices, your entire section from bottom to top. So you have all the voxels rotating during the recording, and when you record them, they send you a signal with a different frequency and phase. You can differentiate them to determine their origin from any location, and you can also know the intensity with which they arrived. The intensity depends on the magnetization. Now, the frequency or location and the phase depend on the y-axis gradient and the x-axis gradient, because you will know how fast these points are rotating, how fast they are rotating, how fast they are rotating, how fast they are rotating, and how fast they are rotating, right? So, in the y-axis, it rotates and comes to you at an earlier time. And since it comes to you at an earlier time, you now know exactly the result of the gradient you applied at the location of the voxel. Each voxel rotates in the x and y axis with different frequencies. What does the frequency depend on? It depends on what you applied, and in the y, your phase comes to you at a different time, one earlier than the other. Based on the gradient, we essentially apply it to the lens in a practical sense. Yes, then you start doing what exactly? Now here is the 90-degree pulse, and here is the 180-degree pulse, for instance, specifically in this context. With 90 degrees for slice selection and some 180 slice selection, when you give 180, you need to have a slice selection gradient to differentiate between the sections. Here, you will apply phase encoding gradient. Now, perform the frequency encoding gradient recording. So why do I keep the phase encoding on all the time while I turn the frequency encoding gradient on and off? The reason is that if you apply frequency encoding with phase encoding, both gradients will be in opposite directions. And what will happen, doctor? They will cancel each other out. Therefore, you cannot continuously apply both. You only do it during the pulse signal and then revert it back. So, what does it mean? It means to do what? To do revising and devising. You detect your signal in the middle, and that's it. This phase encoding is degrees or steps. Each step you repeat it again with a new step and a new angle. The frequency that my dad cut off from the receiving signal. Because you want to determine the location of the focus, how will you define it? You will now apply a gradient on the y-axis and a gradient on the x-axis.